The forest did not begin speaking to him immediately. And that silence was the first lesson, because the days stretched heavy and almost motionless, filled with small victories and great humiliations, when he realized that even fire did not always obey him, that food did not come by desire, and that the body quickly forgets pride when the cold slowly teaches respect. "You think you have become stronger," he told himself, looking at his hands covered with cuts and cracks. "But in reality, you simply have not yet paid the full price, and the forest always comes to collect its debts." At night, it seemed to him that the trees changed places, that the paths he had laid with his own feet disappeared as if they had never existed. And in those moments, fear returned not as panic, but as a cold thought that if he got lost, he would not even be able to explain where exactly he had died, because in the forest there are no coordinates for memory. "You take directions away from me," he whispered into the darkness, sitting by the dying fire. "But I am still here, and as long as I breathe, you have not decided for me." The forest answered with sounds, with the cracking of branches, with the heavy breathing of the night. And one day he realized that this was not a threat, but a test, because the one who fears every rustle will never hear real danger. And from that moment, he began to listen differently, not with his ears, but with his whole body. Tense, attentive, ready. Months passed, and loneliness ceased to be emptiness. It became a mirror from which there was nowhere to avert his gaze, because every thought, every memory returned without filters, without justifications. And in these long internal dialogues, he admitted for the first time what he had been running from in the world of people. "I did not run away from them," he said one morning, looking at the fog among the trees. "I ran away from who I became beside them, from the voice that agreed when it should have screamed." Hunger made him honest. Fear made him cautious. And silence made him mercilessly attentive to his own thoughts. And when one day he saw the tracks of another person, his heart tightened not with joy, but with panic. Because during this time the forest had taught him a simple truth: not every human is salvation. "If someone is here," he said aloud, holding the knife as if it were not a weapon, but a last argument, "I am not looking for war, but I will not allow what I have left to be taken from me." There was no answer. The tracks disappeared. And it was then that he realized the greatest change had already happened, because before he had been afraid to be alone, and now he was afraid of losing this solitude as the only place where he still belonged to himself. The forest heard this, he was sure of it, and from that day the trials became harsher, as if someone had decided to test whether this human was truly ready to live without witnesses, without judges, without applause, because ahead was winter, which does not forgive self-deception and leaves no room for half-decisions. The forest did not begin by taking his body, but his habits, and that was more painful than hunger, because every morning he woke with the thought that just a little more and he would break, that one more cold rain, one more night without fire, one more day without food, and his mind would begin to bargain, offering return as mercy rather than defeat. "You did not come here for that," he told himself, sitting under a wet shelter of branches while the rain beat against the leaves as if the forest were trying to kill the sound of his thoughts. "You came because there you were already dead, just still breathing." Winter came earlier than he expected, and with it came the understanding that the forest is neither enemy nor friend, but a system that does not care about your reasons. And when his fingers stopped obeying him and sleep became short and torn, he spoke to the forest for the first time, not as a force, but as something stronger. "I am not asking for help," he whispered, coaxing a weak fire. "I am only asking for time, and if that is too much, then say it now, because I no longer want to die slowly." There was no answer, but the wind shifted, and the flame survived. And he accepted this not as a sign, but as a random leniency, because the forest does not give hope, it gives chances, and chances carry no guarantees. Loneliness began to break him from the inside, because without people the need to lie disappeared, and every thought sounded louder than any scream. And in these long inner dialogues, he returned again and again to one question he had never dared to ask before. "Who exactly am I trying to save?" he said into the darkness. "My true self, or the one I wanted to appear to be?" One evening he heard a human voice, distant, broken, almost unreal, and his heart tightened so hard that he felt physical pain, because hope returned not as warmth, but as a threat, and he stood hiding among the trees, understanding that one step forward could destroy everything he had built inside himself over months of silence. "If you are human," he finally said, loudly but without strength, "do not come closer, because I am no longer who I was, and I do not know whether I will be able to stop myself if I have to defend this place." No answer came. The voice vanished as if it had never existed, and only then did he realize that he feared not attack, but a return to a world where every decision can be hidden behind words, laws, and someone else's responsibility. The forest accepted his fear and answered with nothing, and it was precisely in this indifference that he felt the first true trial, because now he had to live not a day or a month, but years, knowing that no one would come, no one would explain, no one would say that he was doing the right thing, and that ahead lay the moment when the forest would demand a payment that could not be postponed. The second year began not with cold, but with silence, and this silence was different, thicker, heavier, the kind in which even one's own thoughts felt excessive, as if the forest had already taken everything it could without a direct blow, and was now waiting to see whether the human would give up the rest on his own. "You are still here," he told himself one morning, looking at the tracks near the shelter that could belong to an animal, a human, or something worse. "Which means either you have learned, or the forest has not yet decided what to do with you." The body had become different, thinner, harder, as if every muscle remembered not strength, but economy. And when pain came, he no longer asked why, because pain in the forest had no meaning. It had a function, to remind that life is not given in advance and cannot be stored for later. One day he saw a hut, old, half-ruined, hidden so deeply that it could not have been accidental, and his heart slammed against his ribs with such force as if someone were trying to tear it from his chest, because it meant only one thing. Someone had already lived here, someone had endured, someone had left or died. "You were not the first," he whispered, touching the rotten wood. "And if you vanished, then the forest guarantees nothing, not even to those who learn to listen." Inside he found traces of life, torn notes, tools made by hands that knew fatigue, and among this silent evidence of another struggle, he suddenly felt fear, not for himself, but of becoming the same kind of memory, without a name, without a story, without an explanation. "I do not want to disappear like this," he said aloud, and his voice sounded Chujim. "I do not want the forest to remember me only as another mistake." That same night a storm came, real, furious, the kind that bent trees like bones, and in this cacophony he screamed into the darkness, not from fear, but from anger, because he suddenly realized that the forest was not testing him. The forest simply existed, and all these 2 years of struggle had not been a battle, but a conversation with his own emptiness. "If you want to break me," he shouted, clutching the ground, "then do it now, because I will no longer run. I will not hide. I will not ask permission to live." The wind roared in response, but there was no intention in that roar, and this became the revelation, because the greatest threat was not in nature, but in the fact that he was trying to find meaning where no one had promised it. When the storm ended, he remained alive, but changed, and sitting among broken branches and washed-out earth, he understood that the second year had taken his last illusion, that survival makes a human special, because in truth it only exposes who you have always been. And it was precisely then, in this harsh clarity, that he felt the finale was near, because the forest was no longer an enemy, no longer a trial. It had become a mirror, and there is no escape from a mirror, even if there is not a single path around. The third winter arrived unnoticed, as if the forest no longer considered it necessary to warn him. And that was the most frightening part, because when danger stops frightening, it begins deciding for you. And one morning he woke with the feeling that the boundary was already near, even though no signs of it were visible. "You have gone too far," he told himself, rubbing his stiffened hands. "But now turning back will hurt more than death, and that is probably the most honest thing you deserve." Food became scarce, and strength became a variable, and every step demanded a decision that once seemed automatic, because now even movement had a price. And in this constant economy of life, he thought for the first time, not about survival, but about the meaning of continuing. One evening he heard the crack of branches very close, not cautious, not predatory, but human, heavy, uncertain. And his heart struck so hard that he grabbed the knife not out of aggression, but out of fear of losing himself, because an encounter meant the end of solitude, and with it, the end of justifications. "Step into the light," he said hoarsely. "If you came for food, for warmth, or for a human, then know that I no longer know how to share without consequences." A man emerged from the darkness, just as exhausted, with eyes in which there lived not anger, but emptiness. And in this meeting there was no joy, only cold recognition, as if they were looking at different versions of the same mistake. "I thought there was no one here," the stranger said, and his voice trembled not from cold, but from realization. "I thought that if I went far enough, the world would stop asking questions." "It does not stop," he replied, feeling how the words hurt. "It only changes form, and now it looks you in the face without witnesses." They sat in silence by the weak fire, neither trusting nor hating, and in this tense quiet, each understood that the forest had not brought them together by chance, because there were no accidents here, only the consequences of different escapes. "I do not know what to do next," the stranger admitted, and there was no weakness in those words, only fatigue. "I can no longer return, but here I do not become someone else either." He looked at the flame and felt an answer rise in his chest, the one he had feared all this time, because it promised neither salvation nor meaning, only choice. "The forest gives nothing," he said slowly. "It only takes away what is unnecessary, and if you are still waiting for it to make you someone, then you came to the wrong place." They did not part that night, but they did not grow closer either, and it was precisely in this fragile balance that he felt the finale was inevitable, because now before him stood not the forest, but another human, and the choice could no longer be postponed under the guise of survival. The morning was too quiet, and in that silence he immediately understood that the decision had already been made, even if the words had not yet been spoken, because the forest never leaves room for doubt in the finale. It only allows a person to pretend that the choice is still ahead. The stranger packed silently, moved slowly, as if every step were a farewell not to a place, but to a version of himself that still believed escape could become an answer. And when he finally spoke, his voice was even, but empty. "I will leave," he said without looking back, "because if I stay, one of us will disappear, and I do not want the forest to decide which one." He watched him go and felt something break inside, not from loneliness, but from the realization that now he had a choice, a real one, painful, the kind that cannot be shifted onto cold, hunger, or darkness. "You can stay," he finally said loudly, as if addressing not only the man, but the forest itself. "But then we will be responsible for each other, and there will be no solitary decisions here anymore." The stranger stopped, remained silent for a long time, and in that pause there was more fear than in any storm, because responsibility frightened more than death. But eventually he slowly turned back, and there was no hope in his eyes, only consent. "I will stay," he replied, "not because I want to live, but because I no longer want to run." The forest did not react, did not give signs, did not change, and that was the final lesson, because it had never been an arena or a trial. It had been a background against which a human finally stops lying to himself. A few more months passed, and they lived side by side, not as friends and not as enemies, but as witnesses to one another, sharing silence, fear, and labor. And in that togetherness, he felt for the first time that 2 years in the forest had not taught him how to survive. They had taught him how to be responsible. "If we ever leave this place," he said one evening, looking into the fire, "the world will not become simpler, but at least we will know that escape is not freedom." The forest listened but did not judge, and when spring came, he understood that the finale of this story was not that a human survived among trees, but that he stopped hiding, because the real exit begins not with a path out of the forest, but with the readiness to live without justifications, even when there are no walls around.